Welcome to Rejected Religion Spotlight. My guest today is Ninian Nijhuis. And Ninian is currently a research master student in religious studies, specializing in Western esotericism at the University of Amsterdam. And she also holds an LLM in public international law from Utrecht University. So welcome to Spotlight, Ninian.
Yeah, thank you for having me.
I'm very happy that you could join me today. Thanks.
Yes,
it's good to talk to you again.
Mm.
So recently you gave a presentation that I was able to attend and watch you or listen to you. Actually, it was all through Zoom. So the online thing anyway, but it has to do with Carl Jung, and that is he is one of your research interests. And more specifically, how religion and spirituality intersect with psychology. And as I said, you had recently presented a paper at the Jung Graduate Symposium on June 17th called Carl G. Jung and His Not So Fantastical Madhouse that we're going to discuss today. So in this article, you note that the black books that Carl Jung wrote were actually his notes about his self-experimentation with his own consciousness. So I would guess that maybe the viewers might not be so familiar with these black books. So could you talk more about what these black books were all about?
Yeah, sure. So, I mean, for those who have heard of Jung, of Carl Jung, he was a 20th century psychologist, associated with Freud as well, as the two were very good friends, but they eventually kind of split up and they went their own ways. So for the most part, his body of work was basically consisted of his psychological writings, more kind of academic. And the black books are very personal. They're not diaries in kind of the literal sense of like what happens during the day. But basically, I'll go a bit into the context because it's actually quite, vital to know kind of why he started writing in them. This was during the time leading up to the First World War. And he was, his relationship with Freud was a bit rocky, and he was like going into mythology and more into study of it. And going really deep into that and kind of developing his own thought and his own theory. And that's kind of where he saw that his theory started to differ from Freud's. And also kind of, I believe his first fantasy that he actually wrote down in the black books was in 1913. So it was kind of towards the end of 1913. And he also had a couple of like visionary experiences where he would sit in a train and had 2 times in the same train ride, 2 weeks apart. He had a kind of a visual hallucinations, like when he was in a tunnel, basically seeing Europe in catastrophe, like flooded and debris like floating everywhere and bodies. And he had this vision 2 times. And then he also, he was kind of figuring out, what is this? What is happening to me? Am I going crazy? Or is there something else going on? And there was a very big, like, long time until World War I started, that he genuinely had a fear that he might go crazy. He actually told Mircea Eliade, for those esotericists will probably know who I'm talking about, he told him that he was actually scared at that time that he was going to do a schizophrenia, which is kind of the talk they had around the time. So he had a couple of visions. He also had a dream that repeated 3 times before the outbreak of the war, in which the same thing happened. He would see Europe. He would be in a foreign land, like an English-speaking foreign land, and had to rush back home. And the moment he got back into Europe, there was an icy cold that descended from the heavens. And he would also see like a yellow flood, and he would see Switzerland kind of protected by mountains. So he initially interpreted those in a personal sense, thinking I'm probably hopelessly off. I might be still protected because he identified himself with Switzerland, but when, because he was he had a conference in England. So he was like, well, probably when I'm in England, I have to go back, and this is the moment I go crazy. But when he was writing a paper about schizophrenia, which is kind of, ironic. Then the moment that he was, right after the conference, he saw in the newspapers that war had broken out, so he had to rush back. And the moment he went, he kind of embarked, I think it was Holland, the war had started, and it started to realize, oh, wait, it was not about me. This was not personal. This is about the collective. Something big is happening. And I mean, obviously Switzerland stayed neutral for that war. So, it all kind of came true in its own sense. So up until that point, he was already starting to write the black books. And what he basically started doing is because he had these involuntary visions, he started to make them voluntary. What he would kind of do some sort of meditative or mental exercises to calm his mind down so that the fantasies can kind of conjure up on its own. And then he would just observe it and write it down. The exact specifics of this are a bit unknown because obviously, I haven't seen any work where he really goes into detail what he thinks that it is. But it was kind of based on what he later would call active imagination, which is a therapeutic kind of exercise in which he would, it's not really hypnosis because he would just let the patient just experience what his unconscious mind wanted to bring up. And he would do that with himself. And he did some kind of exercises where he would just build little cities in his backyard with stones, just to kind of get his mind to forget about anything. And that's when the fantasies would start to come up. So he jotted them all down until 1930. And so this is kind of the raw, emotional manuscripts of those experiments. And the Red Book, which is a little bit more known, is also a personal work of his, which really goes into those fantasies and about religion and about kind of the state of the collective state. And the Red Book is based on the Black Books. So it adds extra commentary, a lot of the interpretations can also be drawn from what's in the Red Book. But the Black Books there are more fantasies. Not all the fantasies are in the Red Books. And the Black Books are a lot more emotional. You can really see kind of the wording. Some of the wording is different in comparison to the Red Book, which is obviously a little bit more edited because more thoughts went into that. As with the Black Books, he just jotted them down as he went. Yeah.
Okay, so the what you called the fantasies, could we maybe understand that as a calming the mind, calming the body, and then a type of free association as the term is now used for just people who are just letting, as you said, letting the thoughts come up as in a natural manner, or because fantasy, when I guess maybe I have very rigid ideas about what a fantasy is that this is not something that he deliberately constructed, but just kind of unfolded.
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
So I also was wondering, did he have a significance for the colors that he used with black and red? Did that mean anything to him?
I'm not sure.
Okay.
I believe the black books are called black books because he wrote them down in a black notebook.
Okay. Very simple.
So and that might be true as well for the red book, where because his original red book was like this really beautiful bounded red book that was pretty big as well, and he would like paint in it and with calligraphy, made it like an artwork almost. Yeah. Okay. I have the reader's edition here, but I went to a friend and he has the real version.
Yeah.
And it's beautiful. It's stunning. It's amazing. So if anybody has the money and is interested.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay, so. But like as you said, it could just be a very simple explanation that it was black or it was red. The covers. Yeah. Okay. Well, in one of the black books, Jung writes about a fantasy that he had about a madhouse. What was happening in this fantasy, and what led up to this fantasy of him experiencing this madhouse that he found himself in?
Yeah. Okay. Well, so this fantasy was written down in the period where he was still unsure of what was happening with himself. Okay. So it was written before the war. It was in January of 2014. The war broke out in August, and it's actually interesting because the fantasy is spread out over a couple of days, so it's not kind of dreamed up in just one session. But it basically starts in a library where he is renting a book, and he wants to rent the book by Thomas à Kempis, The Imitation of Christ. And he actually has a discussion with the librarian about it, because, given his scientific standing, and it was kind of, because he really identified as a scientist, the librarian was kind of shocked or stunned or intrigued by why he would choose that book. His explanation was that I actually have, he basically said that there are moments in life where science actually leaves you sick and empty. And this is why I appreciate a book like Thomas's, because it's written from the soul. So he also said, you know that I experience science very deeply, but there are just some moments in life where science cannot help you. And so they have a discussion, and there's more stuff going on, but eventually he enters into the librarian's kitchen, where he meets a cook, and he's talking with the cook a bit, and then at one point something happens where there's kind of a lot of people coming through the kitchen, which are they're called the dead, and then there is a spirit called Ezekiel, the Anabaptist, in his fantasy, that starts to talk to him. And it's actually interesting because Ezekiel is a 6th century BCE figure, of a biblical figure. And Anabaptism was a 16th century movement, of a Protestant movement originating from Zurich. And they were met with violent oppression. So it was not a very pretty scene and what happened to them. But they basically underlined the immediacy with like one-on-one contact basically to God, one's personal relationship instead of, the intervention of the Catholic Church or like a church or a priest. So it's interesting that kind of his mind combined the two together in like one character. I believe it probably has something to do with the fact that Ezekiel, as a prophet, he was misunderstood because they believed that his visions were pathological, that he was not a real prophet. And obviously Anabaptism in their time, they were also misunderstood or kind of judged or misjudged. So he started talking to him, and at one point, I believe the cook noticed that he was probably talking to nothing, because apparently what eventually happens, and the fantasy is not super clear about this, but it looks like he's talking to the spirit of Ezekiel, and the cook cannot see him. So to the cook and to everybody around him, he is talking to himself or to, something that is not there. So what happens is that the police comes in and takes him to a madhouse because they believe that he is mad. And the interesting thing is that you often also see sometimes, like in movies, or you hear from people, it's like, if somebody thinks you're crazy, then there's really no convincing them otherwise. It's like they can probably, yeah, that's what you say, because, I would say the same thing. So you really see kind of that dynamic playing out where he's trying to convince the police and everybody else that he is fine and that he's not pathological, but nobody believes him. And so he ends up in a madhouse. He has an interview, and they talk, like, they ask him questions like, well, are you talking to spirits? He said yes. Like, well, where did they come from? So I conjured them up to myself. Like, he's really honest. And obviously based on that, the doctor makes a diagnosis. It's paranoid schizophrenia or paranoid dementia precox, which was kind of the term back then. And even though he tries to say, like, no, but you have, because he agrees with him, being like, yeah, I mean, what I'm experiencing could be seen as pathological. But he tries to explain otherwise, like, still, it was like, but I am fine. This is not, I'm good. And obviously the doctor says, well, you don't know what you're talking about, or you don't have the insight into your illness, or it is an illness, but you perhaps, don't experience it as such. And so he gets committed to the madhouse.
Was it that Jung was trying to stand in the shoes of both as a scientist and as a religious believer, that there was this tension there? Or because when I was reading your paper, it seemed as if the psychiatrist or the doctor at the madhouse, I'm filling in words that I probably shouldn't, the doctor at the madhouse didn't seem to like the idea that Jung was reading The Imitation of Christ.
Oh, yeah. That is actually an interesting detail. Because obviously he has the book with him when he goes into the madhouse. So they ask him what kind of book he's reading. And obviously when Jung shows them, they're like, oh yeah, of course, this is a religious form of dementia precox. And then he says, like, nowadays the Imitatio Christi leads to the madhouse. And that is actually interesting because it basically already says that no matter how honest you are with engaging in that, it's always going to be taken the wrong way, a bit like that. So, and that is what he also kind of realized, as even that in kind of the current environment or societal kind of understanding that was alive back then, is that if one was too kind of involved with anything religious, or too trying to emulate it, too much into it, one was automatically like easier understood as madness, as being struck by that. So it is basically also what you see in the fantasies, kind of this dynamic where religion and mental illness are closely linked. And obviously Jung with his work also tried to go against that, where he actually believed, I mean, this is actually an interesting about Jung's character, because he was a psychologist. He was very, very rigid, very meticulous with his research and his everything, and with his writing. And it's only towards the end of his life, like, here and there that he was talking about his fantasies. It was known that there was something like a red book, and it's probably also known that there was something like black books in like the inner circle. He talked about his fantasies in 1925 in some seminars. So the public knew a bit about that, but they never knew kind of the depth and the scope of it. And interestingly, the red books were only published in 2020, so last year, and the red book was published in 2009. And also his autobiography or biography with Ninian Nijhuis was published, I believe, right after his death. And in those books, you really kind of see the duality of his character, that he was also like, there was one interview where somebody asked him, was like, do you believe in God? And his answer was, I do not believe, I know. So his he was very much convinced, like, because he had so many evidence throughout his practice that there was something like religion, there was something like a collective unconscious, there was something living down there. And that obviously informed his own attitude towards religion. But he was a very he really valued experience at the grounding of his belief or his knowing. Yeah, when it comes to religion.
So I would imagine that the climate, the professional climate that he found himself in, that might be problematic if he is talking about visions and, I don't know if you could say, premonitions or things that might be viewed as being either religious or in the sphere of the supernatural, things that cannot be really proven by empirical science, and that might create a tension for him in that regard, and that there was difficulty for him in trying to reconcile his professional career with all of these things that were happening to him, and then the fact that people didn't really know, outside of a very small circle, as you said, but people didn't really know that all of this stuff was happening with him. So this might have been difficult for him to balance, perhaps. But this leads me to my next question. In your opinion, now that you've read these books, the black books and the red book, what, in your opinion, was Jung trying to sort out with this particular fantasy in the madhouse?
Basically, the fantasy in its entirety, because towards the end of the fantasy, he has some, like, you could say, realizations, where he kind of philosophizes around ideas of madness and kind of realizes that this society lacks like an understanding of divine madness, which is kind of a form of madness that is not actually negative, that is not actually impairing a person's life, but actually adding to it. And then he also, he talks to his soul in a lot of his fantasies. Like the black books are also seen as kind of the conversations with his soul and the other inhabitants of his psyche. And his soul actually weighs in at one point and says, like, do you see your madness? Do you accept it? Like, you wanted to accept everything in your life and everything that you are, so accept madness too. It's like everything is madness. Everything is mired in madness. Divine madness is a form of higher rationality, which clings to a lot of philosophies and to a lot of like influential books and artworks. And that is actually something that is beneficial, and that is just also the other side of everything. He really saw kind of the key towards also mental health and also a happy life is balance. So he saw that, and he kind of divided into the spirit of the depths and the spirit of the times, where the spirit of the times was kind of rational reality, like this reality, like science, everything that we know, the surface, basically. So, things that are material and daily life. Mm-hmm. And then the spirit of the depths was, kind of the darkness, the dreaming, the inside, the collective unconscious. And he said that if you're only with the spirit of the times, if you're only focused and in that, you are sick delusion, you are mad, because it's not balanced. And then if you are only with the spirit of depths, like somebody who's speaking in tongues and who's get lost in his visions, or, like more of these really kind of hallucinatory types of madness, one is taken over by something and one is then also deluded. But the balance is godly. So the balance is then defined, where you can during the day, and you can appreciate science, if I say it really crudely, you can appreciate science, but you can also appreciate religion, because they're two sides of one whole, and they each have their function. They each have value, but just in different ways. Whereas, the spirit of the depths is like at the bottom of its irrational, and the spirit of the time is very focused on this rationality. So there was definitely a tension during kind of his life, because he couldn't really see that you could have either. Well, he thought you could have both. It didn't make you crazy to be a scientist and also like be into this other things. Mm-hmm. But the kind of the professional environment did not really reflect that. And so he tried to also, that's also why he called them fantasies, because visions had, I think, more of a bit more loaded.
Yeah.
A lot of what he experienced during the Black Books became the foundation of his psychology. So it formed like the ground, which he led by experience. He would experience in himself, and then he would help his clients to go towards the same process, basically, that he went through. So everything that he did was kind of grounded in in experience. I was like, well, I've gone through this before. So for him, that made it easier to obviously understand, and maybe that's one of the reasons why his psychology is so influential, because he was very much like participating in his own theory. So I believe that was his experience to figure out what happens in the mind. How is the psyche structured? Are there patterns that I can work with? And obviously he saw a lot of things coming back, like also with his patients. And so it's foundational for his psychology. And that's also why it's very interesting very exciting that they're published now, because I believe this will really propel the study of Jungian psychology into the future. Because now a lot of other things that perhaps weren't so clear before have another layer to them, which can be studied in comparison. So, yeah, that was for him. It was just experimentation. He wanted to just see it for himself. but that wasn't to say that he was very hesitant with showing it to people, that he might think were not ready for it. That was also his biggest concern with the Red Book, that he wasn't sure if he wanted to publish it because he was just very, very concerned that people would not get it or would not understand what he was saying, or perhaps like scorn him away for a mystic, or for, because obviously a lot of people were like, yeah, he's too much into religion, it's not academic, and obviously he would give them the ammunition to be like, ha, see?
Right,
and obviously it's more nuanced than that, but he was just afraid probably that they weren't gonna get that.
I see. Yeah.
Obviously I cannot speak for him, but from what I've studied, I think it might be a bit like that.
Sure, I understand that he had concerns, that would be natural that he would have concerns about this, because he seemed to be, now that all this is coming out, he seemed to be taking a very different approach, in that he was in it with everyone else. He was experiencing the same things that his patients were experiencing, whereas someone like Freud maybe was trying to be a little bit more abstract and meta, and not be involved in the sense of, oh, I know exactly what you feel or how you feel or what you're experiencing, because I've had the same experience. I don't get that impression from Freud. I mean, I'm not an expert, but it doesn't. I always have this idea of this, the classic man sitting in the armchair, and then the chaise longue, where someone is lying down and they're all talking, and this person is not saying anything. They're only writing things down. So it's very detached, and that image, detached image, is not the image that I'm getting from you as you talk about how Jung was trying to help his own patients.
Yeah, that's true to some extent as well. I'm not an expert on Freud. Like I know a bit about him in kind of because I studied him in juxtaposition kind of to the research I did on Jung. And I do see, with also looking with the correspondences between the two, that, Freud was just really kind of hoping that Jung would take up the Freudian torch and would kind of carrying it on to the future, because Jung was younger than him. And Jung obviously, like, he from the beginning, and this is also a bit of a misconception, because a lot of people think that Jung was a Freudian turned Jungian, or that that Jung learned everything from Freud and then he went his own way. And that is not true. Like, when the two met, both of them were established psychologists and were psychiatrists. Well, actually, Freud was a neurologist. And also from the get-go, Jung would tell his concerns and say that, well, these are the things that I don't agree with you. But these are the things that I do agree with you. And Freud basically had this hope that he stated multiple times in his letters, well, I'm sure that, as time passes, you will come much closer to me than my theory than you might now think is possible. Obviously, that was a bit wishful thinking, because that never really happened to that extent. But Freud was very obsessed with, very focused on the sexual aspect of mental disorders. And that's also why it's called libido. And Jung approached that as just energy. He thought that libido meant psychic energy, and it could be sexual, but can also, like, it have a spectrum of different kinds of energies. That was basically a big difference between the two. Where Freud would just see it as sexual energy, and then Jung actually proposed that to see it broader than that, to just see it as psychic energy, of which sexual things could be a part.
Right.
Yeah. So he was very much involved in the process. Obviously, that became really visible later on. that he was so involved. I mean, now we know with the black books, like how much, like, now obviously they were just books, so we cannot know everything. But they give a much more broader understanding of like how personally invested he was in his work. He would actually advise his patients to make their own red books, and to see that book as like almost like a church, where, you know, when you would go to that book, you would go to your soul, and be with your soul. And so he asked, like, he wanted, he kind of guided his patients to walk their own path, not necessarily totally in the likeness of him, because that's also with the imitation of Christ, that he realized that if he really wants to imitate Christ, he has to walk his own path and imitate no one, because Christ in his time was somebody who went by the beat of his own drum. I mean, he was crucified for it. And so that's what he understood. It's like, well, if I want to really imitate him, I have to just find my own truth, walk my own path, like not in a likeness of anybody, but really see what is my own truth in this story. And that's also what he did with his own patients.
Very interesting insights there, and little tidbits of information that I didn't know beforehand. So that's always fun to learn new things. If we could come back around to the terms that you mentioned about divine madness as opposed to quote unquote regular madness. It seems like there are dimensions of this, because you were also saying that divine madness could also be seen as a type of genius, because art, music, other expressions can come out of this form of, however you want to put it, this other state of consciousness that produces these things. But in terms of Jung and his ideas about religion, what is the I'm getting ahead of myself. He had these experiences on his own, and then it led him to theorize about how you could discuss and understand what schizophrenia is. So, as you said before, that there was this type of spectrum happening, that things are happening nuanced in this spectrum. Could you talk a little bit more about how religion plays a role in his understanding of the nuances of schizophrenia?
This is a really $1 million question, because because if you're going to answer this question, I mean, it's a really big thing of his work. And I mean, this is basically, especially the difference between madness and then quote unquote divine madness is the topic of my thesis. It's true, there is some sort of spectrum, and there are different dimensions. And what the key for him through his experience was how to differentiate, or how to, how someone is divinely mad or just mad. And with madness, then I mean pathological, like mental pathology. And with divine madness, I then mean kind of genuine religious experience, or genuine like spiritual or psychic experience. And for him, the key was attitude. So for him, it was like, and also what he said is like that eventually what made him that he did not turn mad, because he definitely felt like he walked the rope, is that he kept a balance also when he was doing the fantasies. During the day, he still had his practice, he still had his family. He had his 2 feet in like normal daily life, and then at night he would accept and like have an attitude of openness to everything that would happen. And obviously in the Red books, there are a lot of times where he gets angry or he like curses, he gets very mad at his soul or like the things that are happening to him. And especially in the beginning, he doesn't understand it. And he's, no, this is all nonsense. And how can this be? And it's really interesting kind of discussions that going on between him and his soul. But yeah, basically, so it's about attitudes. And what he also later in his psychological work, what he would, how he would describe, because for instance, with Ezekiel, which was in the fantasy, Ezekiel at the time that he, in his time, like before like 6th century BC, he was regarded as pathological, as mad, while he obviously thought himself more of as prophetic, and Jung also cited, he actually defended Ezekiel or his case in a book called Answer to Job. And in what she said, well, that the visions that Ezekiel were having did not suggest anything pathological going on, because they weren't morbid or any kind, and also it's from what he could read is that Ezekiel did not lose himself in those fantasies. And so basically what happens is that, the same material can come in a person's psyche, but it's about the attitude that the person has to, or does not have, to accommodate for such material. So for instance, if, you're having a vision and you completely lose yourself in that, so you start to really taken over, so that you cannot really distinguish between real life and the vision, which are both real in their own ways. Mm-hmm. That's when you go to the pathological side of the spectrum, because the person cannot deal with it, doesn't have the tools to really like observe the fantasies or to engage with it and to kind of separate himself from what he's experiencing. And that was basically, and a person who could accommodate such material, for instance, what Jung did with his fantasies, and was that he kind of accepted the fantasies as real, but he still knew that they were fantasies. So, and there were still, they could still be interpreted, and they could have a value or a meaning, kind of telling something about the psychic state or about anything. But he was able to kind of, still function in his normal daily life. He wasn't somewhere crawled up in a ball in the corner, and didn't know who he was or what he was. And that was basically his biggest difference. Also, he believed that, because how he later explained why he was having those involuntary visions about and premonitions basically about World War I, was he kind of philosophized that there were certain individuals that were highly intuitive types, that whenever big social or political upheaval would be coming, it was already kind of brewing in the unconscious. So all the materials were already there. Is that, the unconscious knew something was going to happen. And highly intuitive people can pick up on that. So they get the information in the dreams and in the visions about prophetic experience about what's to come. And this can be distorting, obviously, because it's kind of throws you off a bit. But it's if there is nothing like really pathological in the personality or in the psychic mind at that time, the person can accommodate, has the tools to accommodate for it. And it's like, okay, so I had a vision. It's something that happened. I don't think I'm going crazy or anything, but, and kind of takes it seriously in a way that doesn't make that person lose himself. And then there would also, but for instance, if the person already had a pathological environment, or there was already something not like something a bit off, then that person could be taken over by that force of the collective unconscious coming in and lose himself and go nuts, basically. And obviously, it could also be that the person was already so pathological that the unconscious kind of came in because there was something wrong. He actually believed that every time a person would go crazy, quote unquote, is that the unconscious was basically throwing in information. It's like, something is wrong. Here you have all the information you need so that you can fix it. So it was actually kind of a self-regulating mechanism. And Jung's psychology was kind of a tool to guide a person through it, like, to pick it apart and to see, like, okay, what are your dreams telling you? What do you need to change? Like, what is going wrong in your mental attitude towards life or towards certain experiences? Or what guilt or grief there that is kind of messing all things up. And to give, for instance, an example of a person that was very influential but a bit tricky is, for instance, he names Nietzsche. Friedrich Nietzsche, the philosopher. His book, Thus Spoke Zarathustra, is one that is often connected to Jung's Red Book. And Jung meets him multiple times as well. But regardless, he would say in his psychological work that although Nietzsche was a very intuitive type, and that definitely helped to kind of create the art that was Zarathustra, that was the words of Jung, he had a pathological personality. And so a lot of the material that ended up in that book had something to do with his own personal environment than with the collective. So, I mean, Thus Spoke Zarathustra is to me like a combination. And he said, is like, how do we know if it's divine madness or a combination of both? And this goes back to William James and his quote, "By their fruits you shall know them, not by their roots," is that to know whether religious experience is genuinely religious or whether it's like something pathological is to look at what is the value and the significance for that person. Because where it really comes from and what it really is by its origin, we'll probably never know. We don't have the tools to know where it comes from. We can only see what it does. What are the fruits that come from it? What does it mean for the person itself? And based on that, we can kind of judge its validity as divine madness or not. And in the case of Zarathustra, Jung explained that, well, you can judge a work by looking at the life of its writer, of its maker, of its creator, and judge based on that. So, and with Nietzsche, Nietzsche, his life wasn't the most healthy. I mean, he was isolated a lot. He didn't really live a happy, healthy life. And based on that, Jung could kind of conclude, well, that's probably why there are some things in Nietzsche's work that are a bit off. Although they were still intuited and because they still had a tremendous impact. But it's interesting in that sense that you look at that, for instance, what kind of role Nietzsche's work played within this philosophy of Hitler. Whereas, obviously, because I believe that Nietzsche, if he would see what happened with this psychology, he would probably roll around in his grave a couple times because he probably did not want that to happen. But it's interesting that Nietzsche is one of the most misunderstood philosophers of our time. And I think Jung kind of explains it quite beautifully. If you look at his work within Jungian psychology, it's quite fascinating.
It is indeed. This is all very fascinating. And now that these books are published, all of them, the black and the red, I'm just personally very interested to read them just for myself. But I can imagine that for psychology in a broader sense, in a broader context, that this or that these works can offer a really depth of engagement with the the general ideas that people understand that Jung had in his theories about mental health, and also I guess the spiritual side of one's health, the mental health, the physical health, everything. It was kind of more of a total package, I guess, in that regard. So I can imagine that these books will have a great influence on how Jung's oeuvre is perceived. Really interested to see how that all unfolds and what people will be saying about that. So, but thank you for sharing all of this with me today, and all of your own insights as well. I really appreciate that. It was very nice to be able to talk to you about all of this because your presentation was rather short. You could only hit, it's always that way. You only have an allotted amount of time. So it was nice to be able to really pick apart all of these different little points that you made in your article to talk about all of this. So thank you for that. Before we wrap up, I'd like to mention to the viewers that you are the head of social media for the Center of History of Hermetic Philosophy and Related Currents, otherwise known as the HHP Center at the University of Amsterdam. You're also a student representative of the Students Association of the HHP. And I've had the pleasure of collaborating with you in the HHP Center over the past year or so. So for those who are engaging on social media, any posts that you see that are coming from Amsterdam Hermetica or HHP, those are all Ninian's posts. It's all Ninian's work, all of her great work that she's doing. But aside from this, Ninian, if people are interested to know more about what you're doing and like to follow your research and keep up with what you're doing, how can they find you?
Well, I have an academia page.
Okay.
You will probably link that, but it's just my name, Ninian Nijhuis. But my name is a bit tricky for some, so so yeah, I have academia where you can find. Well, by the time that this is up, I will upload the paper that we talked about as well. So if anybody wants to, go back into that, they can. Besides that, I do have Instagram. I'm not super, super active on it, though. I think that I might post a bit more about astrology in the future, which is another big sidereal astrology, which is a big interest of mine. So yeah, if people want to follow that, that's also just my first and last name at Ninian Nijhuis. I am on Facebook, but I'm barely there, so don't.
Well, you seem to be more busy with doing all of the other social media posting.
Exactly, yeah. But yeah, Amsterdam Hermetica, at Amsterdam Hermetica on Instagram. That is very great if you're into Western esotericism or anything related to the more alternative scenes of religion and spirituality. Because that's I'm there always. So that is basically a lot of
all of your great posts. It's a really good place also for other conferences or events or lectures, and you're always making sure that everybody is really up to date and with the finger on the pulse. So you're doing a really great job. And speaking of the astrology, you just recently uploaded an article about that as well on academia.
That's true.
So if people are interested in that they can also see that on that site, academia.edu. I will be sure to put all the links in the description box below.
I have another paper about Jung there as well. It's about religious experience. So that might be a good starting point if anybody wants to get into this.
Definitely. So that will be totally available for the
Yeah.
viewers to check out if they are so inclined and interested. And I think this is just really fascinating stuff to just on, on a personal level. I've always been fascinated with Jung, but it's really nice to be able to learn more about what was really going on with him and his own personal life and his own personal
Yeah.
experiences. So that's really nice opportunity here that I have with you today. So thank you so much again for
Well,
making
thank
time.
you.
You're a
Yeah.
very busy person, so I appreciate the fact that you make time for me. I've really enjoyed hearing more about your paper, and I hope that the viewers will leave questions and comments for you if they'd like to engage with you. I hope that
Oh, yeah.
that they will do that here.
Ask
So
away.
good luck with everything.
Yeah, you too.
Thank you
You're
so
doing great
much.
work. So,
Thank you so much.
and thank you for having me. This was really a lot of fun.
It's my pleasure. My pleasure. All right. Well, to the viewers, thank you for watching, and I hope to see you again soon.